Vice President Johnson had been too poor to go to school, and his wife had taught him to read and write. So Johnson didn't hate slavery so much as he despised the big plantation owners with an abiding and a profound dislike, because Johnson did not fit in with the educated people in Washington, and he knew that he was just being used to prop up Abraham Lincoln's ticket. Johnson liked to travel making speeches, and his main argument was that slaves were private property, and thus the government had no business interfering in the business of keeping slaves, and he enjoyed engaging in animated discussions with the crowds, and would get into fistfights with the hecklers. Johnson knew that slavery had to end because it was trying to overthrow the government, and he freed his own familial slaves in 1862 and saw to it that 20,000 soldiers of African descent were recruited into the Union Army. Swarthy, strong-visaged, combative, he made a drunken spectacle of himself at the inauguration, but he was not, as most historians are quick to insist, drunk by mistake. The speech he made came from a mind which was accustomed to inebriated diatribes and in full flavor with the whiskey, quote, a rambling, egotistical speech, close quote, which made people call him an insolent, drunken brute. A History of Presidential Elections, page 203. America had imposed the first protective tariff against English trade goods in 1816, which helped the North but not the South. So the war between the states was in some measure about getting rid of cheap labor so the North would be able to compete in the market. But the South was also not paying their fair share of taxes. And as England fought tariffs and tax laws, the southern states found themselves, in essence, trading with the enemy. To make matters worse, each American state used a different currency, and the government needed all states to use one kind of money, and that would begin with the Lincoln greenback. In exchange for industrial goods, the North did not want to accept the South's Confederate dollars, whose value was determined by bankers in London, not to mention that the Confederate flag closely resembled the British Union Jack. And while the South had little to trade but cotton, Northern merchants were creating a wide variety of products that were not just sustaining the American homeland, but had made them self-sufficient. After the War of 1812, New England had built their own cloth-making machines because they had plenty of substantial rivers to power water wheels, while the South was simply flat and mostly agricultural. After a while, the New Englanders began to use the power of steam, but the South didn't build these kinds of factories because they didn't have to, since Africans were doing all that sort of work. By 1860, there were 4 million Africans in the South, and less than 1 in 1,000 were living free, and 1860 was also the biggest year for importing Africans. Americans were required to start paying income tax in 1861, which angered the South because it taxed at 3% only those with an income over $800, and the tax rate increased to 10% on incomes over $10,000. So the largest portion of taxes would come from plantation owners, not from the northern factory workers. To protect the Confederate dollar, the southern states seceded and then quit selling cotton to England, hoping to pressure the British military into coming over to help the South fight against the North. Unfortunately, England had plenty of cotton stored in warehouses, so they just rode out the war between the states, although Britain would pay the victorious North upwards of $15 million in damages caused by Confederate warships the South had bought from England. Robert C. Winthrop said that in 1856, The South is, upon the whole, the very poorest, meanest, least productive, and most miserable part of creation, and therefore ought to be continually teased and taunted and reviled by everyone, by everybody who feels himself better off. A History of Presidential Elections, page 165. In 1858, the British Crown had finally been able to take over the East India Company's reign after they'd been weakened by the Indian Mutiny. And instead of getting cotton from the American South, England geared up to get cotton from Egypt and from India, now that the Queen was the sovereign of India. But their investments in growing cotton would suffer from Islamic uprisings in both India and Egypt. In 1857, the South was hit by a panic in the New York commodity exchange market. For a time, money exchange with England virtually ceased, and so did the effective demand for cotton in England. A cotton crop that could have sold for 100 million went for 65 million. Violence in America, Historical and Comparative Perspectives, edited by Hugh Davis Graham and Ted Robert Gurr. Beverly Hills Sage Productions, Inc., 1979, page 423. The North was even exporting food, grains, and livestock to the agricultural South, and free farmers were saying politically that they did not want to compete economically or socially with plantationers whose field hands worked without pay. But the South itself was enjoying early in the 1850s unprecedented prosperity. There was an almost insatiable world demand for cotton, of which the South had close to a world monopoly in production. Along with this, and an improvement in profit from tobacco and sugar cane production, came an increase in the price of prime field hands, the most commonly valuable category of slaves. Their price doubled during the 1850 to 1860 decade, reaching as high as $1,500 per head, and the demand was enormous. It was not easy for Southerners to concede the rightness or the efficiency of an economy based on free labor. Violence in America, page 422. A particular weakness was the plantationers' custom of buying on credit advanced before the sale of their crops. Even before the 1775 War of Independence, it was common for Southern planters to be thus in long-range debt to English merchants. After 1783 there was one change. The creditors were now Northern merchants, mainly in New York. The South quite simply remained money-poor up to 1861 and beyond. Ibid. When the panic hit the stock exchange in 1857, the New York Life Insurance Company failed. Creditors called in their loans. Business came to a standstill, and land speculators out west became scarce, hiding from their clients. The South had been supporting the push west because they wanted to protect and extend slavery, not only because it was the only way of life they'd ever known, but because they were so heavily invested in it. The Southerners had not been able to support the pioneers with any real money or manpower, just lofty talk. And when Fremont conquered California before the South could, the Southern-dominated Congress would make sure that there was hell to pay. When California came in as a free state in September of 1850, that upset the balance between slave and free, and Jefferson Davis became America's Secretary of War in 1852, at a time when Congress was almost as wild as the West. Senators were packing pistols into the chamber and engaging in an interesting amount of gunplay. And when Senator Benton's house burned down in 1855, destroying all the papers and letters from Fremont's expeditions, the House and the Senate adjourned out of sympathy for Senator Benton. Swept along by Benton's influence, Fremont ran for president in 1856, and while his opposition said that if Fremont were president there would be a civil war, the truth was that he might have prevented it. The campaigning was very hostile, and Fremont was called a drunk and a Catholic because he'd been married by a priest after eloping with Jessie, and a newspaper called him, quote, the bastard son of a French fiddler, the ingrate citizen, the heartless traitor to the state of South Carolina, close quote. John Charles Fremont, Character as Destiny by Andrew Rowley, University of Oklahoma Press, 1991, page 289, from the St. Louis Leader, October 5, 1856. Secret political societies were thriving, such as the Know-Somethings and the German Sagnichts, who were vigilantes dressing like the clergy in Spain that had championed the Inquisition. And in 1856, Abraham Lincoln made 50 speeches in support of Fremont's bid for president. When the ballots were counted, Buchanan got 1.8 million votes and Fremont got 1.3 million votes, with Fillmore and his third party, the Know-Nothings, getting almost 900,000 that had split the vote. But the main reason Fremont was not elected was because he was French. When Missouri voted on the slavery issue in 1861, the large majority said North, but those who voted South refused to accept the result of the vote, and the war between the states began right then in St. Louis, with street fighting and homes burned down by pro-slavery mobs, and in the actual war, the third largest number of battles would be fought in Missouri. Kansas suffered more from an outbreak of violence in the streets because there was generally less law and order on the prairie. While further west, when things got out of hand, they would just pin a badge on the fastest gun and call them sheriff. But sometimes the wrong person would be chosen for the job. And that's how circuit court writers came to be, dispensing federal justice to local courtrooms such as that of Judge Roy Bean. When Fremont lost the election, John C. Breckinridge became Buchanan's vice president, and Breckinridge would try for the presidency the following term, since he was so popular in the South. But Abraham Lincoln was nominated instead, and Breckinridge came in third, while the man who had been slated for Fremont's vice president became the minister to France. After that election, any discussion about the institution of slavery failed entirely, because the matter could only be settled by force of arms. Unfortunately, the command at St. Louis was given to one of Lincoln's quote-unquote political generals, John C. Fremont, who, in spite of his former connection with the army, had far more exploration than military training to his credit, and proved to be totally lacking in administrative ability. In November 1861, when his incompetence and the corruption it bred could no longer be tolerated, Lincoln removed him, and a little later he gave the post to General Henry W. Halleck, a middle-aged and uninspiring West Pointer who had left the army to become a lawyer. The Federal Union, A History of the United States to 1865, by John D. Hicks, Cambridge, Massachusetts, The Riverside Press, Houghton Mifflin Company, 1937-1948, page 633. Although he was only 5 feet and 2 inches tall, Fremont, quote, set himself up in style in St. Louis, surrounded by a glittering staff. Fleets of river steamers, ironclad in the new fashion, were assembled on the western rivers. General Fremont, on his part, seemed more interested in headquarters activities than in field operations, which he delegated to General U.S. Grant, a rather nondescript Mexican War veteran who had returned to the army from a life of persistent failure. The Stakes of Power, 1845 to 1877, by Roy F. Nichols, New York, Hill and Wang, 1961-1965, page 123. German Americans would turn the war between the states in favor of the North because they were anti-slavery, and Germans across the river from St. Louis had almost established a new Germany, but it didn't succeed because they thought of themselves as primarily Americans. St. Louis would be the pivotal town in controlling traffic on the Mississippi, and Fremont got along great with Germans, while slave owners called the Germans peasant-minded for insisting on working their own farms. The 12th Missouri Regiment spoke only German, and 100 of them chased 2,000 Confederates out of Missouri while using only sabers, even though 1/3 of them died trying. Fremont promoted many Germans into the rank of officers and promised to pay them with his own money, and Union officers like Fremont and Benjamin Butler put fugitive slaves to work for the Union cause, but Southern spies would have them sent back behind Southern lines. In the West, the Union forces, commanded by John C. Fremont, built up a strong base at Cairo, Illinois, at the junction of the Ohio and the Mississippi, where 39-year-old Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant was placed in charge. But then Fremont upset Lincoln's delicate political strategy by issuing a proclamation freeing the slaves in the area of his command, and since Fremont was neither particularly competent nor particularly interested in getting on with the war anyway, the president fired him. The Last Best Hope, A History of the United States, Part 2, 1815 to 1900 by Forrest McDonald, Leslie E. Decker, and Thomas P. Govan, Addison Wesley Publishing Company, 1972, page 521. The first Union general to die in the war had been expecting Fremont to send him reinforcements which never came, and that general had graduated from West Point and despised Fremont for having been courts-martialed, and for surrounding himself with foreigners. Fremont's campaign literature had been translated into German, and they had held torchlight parades for him, and many seasoned soldiers from Europe had eagerly come to fight in the war under Fremont's command, while the army tore down his house in California and built Fort Mason. Despite the treachery among his own Union compatriots, Fremont managed success by buying guns from overseas on credit, although that may have been a cover story for his having paid with Breckinridge's gold. And when Fremont went to Germany in 1863 to purchase arms, he joined the Berlin Geographical Society and was given a gold medal by the King of Prussia, the Cross of the Order of Merit, while Heinrich Schliemann was digging up ancient Troy. People thought Fremont was as important as Washington and Columbus, and some thought he could have ended the Civil War immediately with his plan to go down the Mississippi, capture New Orleans, and continue up the East Coast seizing ports, since that battle plan had worked in California. And Fremont was not afraid to try, having seen plenty of combat with the Bear Flaggers against the Mexican army. Fremont certainly had more experience than anyone at moving groups of armed men and equipment around, and he had come under fire several times in California on his own ranch. And Fremont could have become president if only he had been willing to defend slavery. It was said that Fremont's campaign had made it possible for Abraham Lincoln to become president 4 years later, and 2 days after the election in 1856, the courts handed down the Dred Scott verdict, which had been no surprise because 5 of the justices were from the South. A slave named Dred Scott had sued for freedom in 1846, and over 10 years later, in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court called Dred Scott an animal rather than a free man, and in their decision they quoted laws pertaining to property rights formerly handed down by the English nobility. Meantime, the radical Republicans, steadily augmented in numbers as the war wore on, pressed insistently for complete and thoroughgoing emancipation. 2 of Lincoln's generals, John C. Fremont and David Hunter, early yielded to this pressure, the first with a proclamation issued in August 1861 which freed the slaves of disloyal citizens in Missouri, and the second with a proclamation issued in May 1862 which performed a like service for all the slaves in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Both orders were revoked by the president, who understood far better than his subordinates the opposition within the North that such a course was sure to arouse. Lincoln would have much preferred a system of graduated emancipation, with compensation to the owners of slaves. In April 1862, Congress adopted such a policy for the District of Columbia, and at Lincoln's suggestion also offered federal funds to the loyal slave states, which were not accepted, to aid them in working out a similar policy. The Federal Union, page 680 and 81. Lincoln's freeing of the slaves happened on the first day of 1863, and he did so because if he proclaimed to the world that the war was being fought to free the slaves, there would be an immediate end to the danger of foreign intervention. His mind made up, he waited 2 full months longer before he acted, so that the winning of a Union victory, Antietam, September 17, 1862, could be cited as proof that his course was not a choice of desperation, then on September 22nd, 1862, he issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the Federal Union, page 681. England's desire to colonize the South had been contingent upon retaining the institution of slavery, and there would be no point in gaining the cotton fields without that established unpaid labor. And even after 600,000 people had died in the war between the states, there would be no real help from the North given to the former slaves, because the war had not been about freeing the slaves, and very little would change for Americans of African descent after the South surrendered. In 1866, there was a race riot in New Orleans where 200 former slaves died, and another in Memphis where 50 were killed, and Congress wanted to make racial discrimination a crime, but hostility in the South was so murderous that they could only compromise by allowing some restrictive black codes until Americans of African origin became prosperous enough to stick up for themselves. This, then, had been the philosophy of Lincoln, that the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people what they need to have done but cannot at all do, or cannot so well do for themselves, in their separate and individual capacities. In all that the people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. Abraham Lincoln, a New Portrait, edited by Henry W. Kranz, New York G.P. Putnam Sons, 1959, page 64. The new laws were just like the old laws, with the word Negro written instead of slave, and the federal military was incapable of stopping marauding vigilantes committing murders in the dead of the night, often carried out with the assistance of the mayor or the chief of police, and there were not enough Northern troops left in the South to maintain order, and the locals had a friend in the White House. Johnson thought that Southern congressmen should be allowed back into Congress as though nothing had happened after the war between the states. And Johnson wanted to use his presidential pardoning power to make everything the way it had been before the war, while some in Congress said that the South shouldn't even be allowed to have states anymore, and not even have the same rights as a territory. When Congress assembled on December 4, 1865, senators and representatives from the southern states, most of whom had been leaders in the Confederacy, were waiting outside the doors to take their seats in the national legislature. Rise of the American Nation by Lewis Paul Todd, New York, Harcourt Brace Yovanovitch, 1972, page 407. Congress immediately took up a constitutional amendment that in future anyone who took an oath of public office, received a salary, and then took up arms against the government would not be allowed to stay in office after the smoke cleared if their side lost. This 14th Amendment also told the South that the U.S. government would not pay them back what it had cost them to lose the war, and also that the U.S. government would not pay them for lost slaves. President Johnson told the southern states not to pass the amendment, so it had to wait until the next election to pass, after all the Confederates had been voted out of office. The North thought it better for free Americans of African descent to have the benefit of living in legitimate states, but Johnson opposed the Northerners, so the South ended up with martial law instead that made everybody unhappy and ate up a lot of tax dollars. Military rule would last until the 14th Amendment passed, and it would take an additional 2 years to get Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia back into the Union. Mary Lincoln had been a laudanum drinker, and during the war, she'd given seances in the White House for people who had lost loved ones on the battlefield. And Mary Lincoln had brought a great deal of comfort to many people during those years. After her husband was murdered, Mary Lincoln would be called a mercenary prostitute for selling off her expensive gowns acquired from those years in the White House. Sensitive and fearful, Mary Lincoln moved to Germany, where people were more respectful and well-mannered, and 5 years later, President Grant awarded Mary Lincoln a pension, knowing it was not good to have Abraham Lincoln's widow living in Germany without any money. One theory of Abraham Lincoln's assassination involved Mary's son Robert's drinking buddies, one of whom was John Wilkes Booth, who was 5 years older than Robert Lincoln. And Booth's older brother Edwin had rescued Robert Lincoln from falling between a moving train and the train platform in 1864. President Garfield was 2 years younger than Edwin Booth, and President Garfield would be shot in the summer of 1881, and Robert Lincoln would be there on the train platform with him when the assassin's bullet struck, and so goes history anonymous. Robert Lincoln would also be present in 1901 at the assassination of President McKinley, who was 6 months older than Robert Lincoln, and McKinley had served in the final days of the war between the states under General Winfield Scott Hancock and General Sam Carroll, and McKinley became Carroll's adjutant in those final complicated days before the surrender on the 9th of April in 1865. McKinley went with Carroll to Washington, D.C., where he served in Hancock's 1st Veterans Corps until they were disbanded in July of 1865, 90 days after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. When the war between the states had broken out, most of Hancock's friends joined the Confederacy, but Hancock had attended West Point and had fought in the war with Mexico in his 20 years of Army service, so Hancock stayed on the Union side, where he enjoyed considerable rank. Hancock would run for president in 1880 on the Democrat ticket, but narrowly lost to the Republican Garfield, and Garfield was shot at the train station 4 months later. President Johnson appointed Hancock as the supervisor of the execution of the Lincoln assassination conspirators, who were hanged on the 7th of July after a thorough military tribunal, and it had been Hancock who was tasked with informing the prisoners that they were to suffer the gallows for killing Lincoln, after which Hancock was sent off to fight Indians. When Abraham Lincoln was carried across the street to his deathbed, his 21-year-old son Robert was immediately brought to his bedside, and General Grant was called back to Washington, D.C. from the Jersey Shore, and he used the same train station where Garfield would be assassinated 15 years later. Some versions of history said that Robert Lincoln fell off the train platform at the end of the line in Jersey City, and Robert Lincoln had recognized Edwin Booth as his rescuer and had told General Grant about it, and General Grant sent a thank you note to Edwin Booth for saving Robert Lincoln. The accident may have happened at the Jersey Street station in Washington, D.C., at New Jersey Avenue and C Street, a B&O station built in 1851 just north of the Capitol, even though riding to the end of the line would have been an entertainment for young people. There was a theater at the resort in Long Branch where the Lincolns and the Grants enjoyed attending, and Long Branch was a beach resort town that McKinley also liked to visit, and they would all escape the sweltering heat of Washington, D.C. by riding the Long Branch of the B&O Railroad up to the Jersey Shore, so it was called the Summer Capital. Long Branch was in New Jersey and was halfway between Philadelphia and New York, and Edwin Booth bought the Walnut Theater in Philadelphia in 1863, and he became manager of the Winter Garden Theater in New York City that year. And Philadelphia was halfway between New York and Baltimore, and Edwin Booth traveled from theater to theater, and may very well have been doing theater business in Long Branch on the Jersey Shore when Robert Lincoln stumbled into the train and almost died falling between the moving train and the platform. Edwin had saved Robert Lincoln's life, and Garfield would be waiting on the platform where trains were leaving for the Jersey Shore at the 6th Street station of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, and when Robert Lincoln fell, He'd just come back from Harvard, where he had been sent in 1860 after just barely graduating from high school. And at Harvard, Robert Lincoln had belonged to the Hasty Pudding Club that specialized in cocktails. Edwin Booth had grabbed his collar and pulled him back up from between the train and the platform, and during the war, Robert was given a safe job procured by his mother on General Grant's staff, where the grown-ups could keep an eye on him. Grant was supposed to be in Lincoln's presidential box that night at Ford's Theater, and History Anonymous refused to retain any record of whether or not Robert Lincoln had been tasked that morning to go to Ford's Theater to inform the theater manager that the president would be attending the play that evening, but someone had been sent. Booth thought that as the news spread about the assassination of Lincoln, he would quickly become the hero of the South, but instead Booth would be killed in a shootout on the 26th of April, and Robert would resign his commission on the 12th of June, and the guilty verdicts for the Lincoln conspirators were handed down 2 weeks later on the 30th of June. John Wilkes Booth had been talking about killing Lincoln for so long that nobody took him seriously anymore, since he was a professional actor and being bombastic was just part of his personality. And Booth had been talking his usual trash that day at the saloon right next door to Ford's Theater, where the Star Tavern and the theater shared a common wall. Booth had been going on and on about killing Lincoln, bragging to his Confederate friends about how easy it would be, and everyone that age drinking in the taverns was attracted to the president's son Robert Lincoln, and John Wilkes Booth had been buying the drinks. All of them were in high righteous spirits that fateful Friday on the 14th of April, having barely become used to the sting of defeat after the surrender at Appomattox 5 days before. And there were more people in the tavern than usual with the war winding down. Abraham Lincoln had attended Ford's Theater regularly ever since it had opened in August of 1863, and John Wilkes Booth had been one of the first actors hired, and Abraham Lincoln would bring his wife and children to sit in the presidential box with him, and Booth had once given Lincoln's young son Tad a rose. Up until the assassination on the 14th of April, Booth had used Ford's Theater as his mailing address, and Booth had been to the theater that day around noon to pick up his mail. And then he went to the livery in the afternoon, where he usually rented a horse, and when Lincoln was killed, the police immediately asked the stagehand who'd been holding Booth's getaway horse what he knew, and the stagehand was able to tell the police from whence Booth's horse had come. The stagehand reported that Booth had said it wasn't the horse Booth usually rented, that it was a quote-unquote skittish mare that would break its halter if left unattended, and while the theater had a stable in the back of the building where theater goers could leave their horses, the story about the skittish mare had been an excuse not to put the horse in a stall, but to have it saddled and ready to make a getaway. The stagehand was instructed to stand by the back door with the reins in his hands, because Booth would be right back. And because he thought he would be hailed as a hero, Booth was acting with impunity. While hiding out for the next 12 days, Booth was shocked to learn from reading the newspapers that even the Confederacy was saddened and dismayed by his actions. The stable master had told the police that he rented out 2 horses to 2 men at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that he'd been told the horses would be picked up around 9 p.m., and he named the 2 men as John Wilkes Booth and Lewis Powell. Within hours of Lincoln's death, the police were at the boarding house of Mary Surratt, and she would hang along with George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell and David Harold. Mary Surratt's boarding house was at what is now 604 H Street Northwest, and it was 5 blocks northwest of Ford's Theater. Mary Surratt also owned a small compound across the Anacostia River in Maryland, 10 miles away from her boarding house in town, and the Surratt compound in Maryland was at a well-known crossroads and included a general store, a wheelwright shop, a stable, and a hotel. But most importantly, it housed a tavern where the disgruntled could sit all day airing their general grievances against the Yankee invasion. The Surratt compound in Maryland was a hotbed of Confederate sympathizers, and it had become large enough to be its own post office, and Mary Surratt's husband had been the official postmaster in 1854, and after Mr. Surratt died of a sudden stroke in 1862, Mary Surratt moved into town in the fall of 1864. The widow and her son John Surratt would visit back and forth from town to the compound across the Anacostia, and even though the war had put an end to mail service to and from the South, the Surratt postman continued it in secret, and Mary Surratt rented out rooms in her boarding house that was 5 blocks away from Ford's Theater, mostly to Confederate sympathizers. Booth had gone up to Mary Surratt's boarding house after getting his mail at noon the day of the assassination, and then he'd gone back to the Star Tavern later in the afternoon. And Booth had bought drinks for a handful of employees from the theater, and had brought 2 people with him who were renting a room from Mary Surratt, George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell. And these 3 would be executed by hanging from the gallows, along with a local pharmacy delivery boy, David Harold. It was more than likely that the people working in the White House knew where young Robert Lincoln had been spending his evenings, and Booth would have not only cultivated Lincoln's son for the purpose of publicity and prestige, but would have enjoyed influencing him unduly against his Yankee father. Many of the young men for whom John Wilkes Booth was in the habit of buying drinks were the deserters and the medical misfits and the runaways and the displaced remnants of the shattered Confederate society that was everywhere that final year of the war between the states. Historians said that Vice President Johnson was also supposed to die the night of the assassination, but that the man tasked with his murder had been too drunk to carry out the deed, so it must not have been a very well-planned attack if the only person Booth could find to save the South was George Atzerodt. After living for years in Port Tobacco, where he had a carriage repair shop in Maryland, George Atzerodt had become a heavy drinker after his carriage business was disrupted by the war, and George's family had come over from Germany 20 years previous and were living in a German community, and George could barely speak English. Along with Mary Surratt's son John, George would make a little money smuggling people and goods across state lines in his rowboat, and George Atzerodt would rent a room in town now and then from Mary Surratt on his smuggling forays, but it was more likely in History Anonymous that George's name, Atzerodt, spelled so differently in the German, Atzerodt, suffered from frequent transposing with the French name Surratt, Surratt. Whenever anyone asked where they could buy drugs, they were told at Surratt's or from Atzerot's. John Wilkes Booth was living at the National Hotel on 5th and Pennsylvania, and Vice President Johnson was living at the Kirkwood House Hotel on 12th and Pennsylvania, and Ford's Theater was on 10th Street 2 blocks north of the Kirkwood, and the White House was 4 blocks away to the west. Booth rented a room at the Kirkwood on the evening of the 14th of April for George Atzerodt, and George just sat drinking in the bar of the Kirkwood Hotel and told people that he was waiting for Booth, who never showed up. George Atzerodt walked around the streets of Washington, D.C., and then he went home to Germantown, and when Booth had paid for the room for George, Booth had left his bank book in the room for safekeeping, perhaps as a surety in the promise that he would be back that night. testimony at the tribunal was that George said that Booth had told him to back up Harold, who was supposed to kill Johnson. So it must have been a spur-of-the-moment plan if this version, purportedly from George, had the players mixed around. Booth had gone to Vice President Johnson's home earlier in the day and had left a calling card. And perhaps he had learned at that time that Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel, and installing George in a room there had been intended for a meeting with the new President Johnson as soon as Lincoln was dead. Johnson was known to be sympathetic to the South, and Booth figured that Johnson would reward him for having made a Johnson presidency possible. After picking up his mail at Ford's Theater at noon, and finding out that Lincoln was coming to the theater that night, Booth had gone up to Mary Surratt's and picked up George and Powell, and he took George to the Kirkwood Hotel and went with Powell to rent a couple of horses for the evening, and George Atzerodt would hang for his dealings with Booth and for his crimes of smuggling during wartime, because smugglers were as good as spies, and in the wake of the assassination, Mary Surratt's son John would escape the gallows by fleeing the country. The second person to hang was Lewis Powell, who had been a poor kid from the deep South who had enlisted in the Confederate Army in May of 1861, the month after he turned 17. Powell was wounded at Gettysburg, shot in the wrist, and captured and sent to a Union hospital, and Powell worked there as a nurse for 2 months. And on the Union side at Gettysburg that first week of July in 1863, Hancock had been wounded in the leg and taken to the same hospital. After those 2 months working as a nurse POW, Powell was put on a train to Baltimore to work in a Union hospital, and he escaped from there within the week. There was a nurse at that hospital in Baltimore who helped him escape, and the nurse took Powell to her mother's boarding house in Baltimore, where he stayed for 2 weeks. Then Powell made his way south to rejoin the fighting. After 4 years of war, Booth had wanted to kill Abraham Lincoln for quite some time, and Lincoln invited his son Robert to the theater that night, but Robert had begged off, saying he was tired, and he may have had one too many at the Star Tavern. The only preconceived plan had been Booth's, and historians would write that Mary Lincoln didn't want to go to Ford's Theater that night, but Lincoln told her the newspapers had printed that he would be at the theater that night, but that wasn't true, because he had only informed the theater that morning that he would be there, and the stagehands had been told around noon to prepare the presidential box for his arrival. The playbill did not announce his presence, although reproductions made later as souvenirs added a line that Lincoln would be at the performance, and only the people at the theater would have known, in addition to Robert Lincoln. When Mary Lincoln had balked at attending the theater by complaining of a headache, Abraham Lincoln may have enticed her by saying that he had ordered her laudanum delivered to the theater, and Lincoln wanted to go because Robert E. Lee had surrendered 5 days ago, and over 1,000 people would be in the theater audience to share the joy. Harold was a pharmacy assistant whose job it was to make home deliveries of medications, and if Harold had been regularly delivering laudanum to the White House, he would have been delivering it to the Seward house as well, and he had also made 3 deliveries in the past to Mary Surratt's boarding house. Secretary of State Seward's house was 1 block north of the White House, and Secretary Seward was well known for helping get justice for free Americans of African descent, and Seward was laid up in bed from a carriage accident with a number of injuries, including a broken jaw and a broken arm. When Harold came by horseback to the White House with a delivery on Friday morning, the 14th of April, He was told to take his delivery instead to Ford's Theatre that evening, and upon arrival at the theatre, Harold was told that the Lincolns were late, and they suggested that he wait next door at the Star Tavern, so Harold walked into the saloon next door and sat down to wait. Harold was at the theatre promptly at 7:30, and Booth arrived a little after 8 o'clock to find Harold and Powell chatting it up at the Star Tavern while Harold waited for the president to show up to sign for Mary Lincoln's laudanum, and John Wilkes Booth knew how to make friends fast. Harold had a delivery to make to the Seward house as well, and the president was late getting to the theatre, arriving in the middle of the second act, and the play had started at 8 o'clock, and sunset was at 7:45 p.m., and twilight ended at 8:15, and the owner of the Star Tavern would testify at the tribunal that he had known Harold since he was born, and could thus identify him, and the owner also swore that he had served Booth a whiskey right before the assassination. History Anonymous agreed that the stagehands had been told to get the presidential box prepared around noon, and that Booth had picked up his fan mail at noon and found out that Lincoln would be attending that night, and Booth went from there to Mary Surratt's boarding house to recruit George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell, and he had installed George at the Kirkwood Hotel, where Vice President Johnson was in residence. Then Booth took Powell to reserve 2 horses for later in the evening, and Booth paid for the 2 horses at 4 p.m. with instructions that they were to be picked up at 9 p.m., and the livery stable was near the National Hotel, 1 block away on the corner of 6th and C Streets. Powell went to run errands, and Booth had dinner at the National Hotel with 2 of the other residents, and Powell arrived back at the Star Tavern at 7 p.m. after picking up something from Mary Surratt's boarding house, and Harold showed up at the Star Tavern at 7:30 to wait for the Lincolns to arrive so he could get their signature on his receipt. Powell told Harold not to worry that it was getting late, that he was willing to accompany Harold to Seward's house since the streets were not safe after dark with all the disbanded soldiers wandering around. And Powell said that he had rented a horse waiting to be picked up 5 blocks away, while Harold's horse was tied up in the stables behind the theatre. Powell regaled Harold with stories of his years of active combat experience fighting in the war, as well as sharing stories about the blessing of morphine used in the Union hospitals, and Powell easily convinced the pharmacy assistant to take him along to Seward's house as an excellent bodyguard for the trip up to Secretary Seward's, 1 block north of the White House. Harold agreed, and it was just young people enjoying themselves on that fine spring evening, and they were having the time of their lives, and they had money, and they had hope, and they had courage. And Booth would wait to make his move until the 3rd act of the play, because Harold and Powell had not yet returned from Seward's house. Powell knocked on Seward's door a few minutes past 10 o'clock and talked his way inside, saying that he had to instruct Seward on how to take the medicine, and he was able to get a good look at everyone inside before he started attacking them, and Booth shot Lincoln at 10:25. The delivery boy Harold was from a better class of people than all of them, and Harold's father had been the chief clerk of the naval storehouse at the Washington Navy Yard for 20 years, and his family had been well off. And Harold had been sent to college, where he obtained his pharmacy license in 1860 from Georgetown College, then had gotten the job as a pharmacist's assistant. Harold's family lived at 636 8th Street Southeast near the Washington Naval Yard, 3 blocks away from the train car tracks along Pennsylvania Avenue, and 2 miles away from Ford's Theatre, and since 1862, the young men had been able to get around town on the new horse-drawn streetcars of the Washington and Georgetown Railroad that had been offering passenger service from the Capitol to the Navy Yard where Harold's father worked. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, fondly called the B&O, had been the first to install the telegraph along its right-of-way in 1843, and it had been over that line that the Whig Party's announcement of their nomination for president was sent from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. on the 1st of May in 1844, followed 3 weeks later at the official opening of the B&O line, with Samuel Morse sending "What Hath God Wrought" on the 24th of May. The first passenger station for the train to Baltimore had been built in 1835 at 2nd and Pennsylvania, and the B&O was 1 block away from the National Hotel at Constitution Avenue. The only railroad bridge between the North and the South was at Harper's Ferry, and it was owned by the B&O, and the South blew up the Harper's Ferry Bridge on the 14th of June in 1861, and that first year of the war between the states began with blowing up bridges and destroying tracks and tearing down telegraph lines. Andrew Carnegie built a railroad line bypassing hostile Baltimore. Andrew Carnegie built a railroad line bypassing hostile Baltimore that would save the Union, and Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland who would build thousands of libraries after the war. Baltimore was 35 miles north of Washington, D.C., along the Chesapeake Bay, and when the war broke out, President Lincoln ordered many Confederate sympathizers in Maryland thrown into jail to prevent Washington, D.C. from being completely surrounded by the Confederate states. In 1862, there were only a few thousand people living in Washington, D.C., and most of them would go elsewhere for the summer, and in all likelihood, the young men who became embroiled in the Lincoln assassination had seen each other while riding on the streetcars, as well as having met one another in the taverns. In the spring of 1865, getting around the streets of Washington, D.C. was still mostly done on horseback or by horse-drawn buggies, and Powell and Booth picked up their horses at 9 p.m. that night and went back to the Star Tavern, where Harold was still waiting for the president to show up to sign his pharmacy receipt. The president had just arrived in the middle of the second act, and one theory was that Harold succeeded in obtaining the signature for the medication, which many thought was the delivery of a telegram, because that seemed more presidential than receiving a bottle of laudanum. Harold and Powell rode away to make the delivery to the Seward house. The president had just arrived in the middle of the second act, and one theory was that after Harold succeeded in obtaining the signature for the medication, which many thought was the delivery of a telegram, because that seemed more presidential than receiving a bottle of laudanum, Harold and Powell rode away to make the delivery to the Seward house. When they got to the Seward residence 5 minutes later, Powell grabbed the medicine from Harold and said he'd take it up to the house, and Powell was 6'2" and built like a bull in his prime. So Harold held his horse while Powell went up the walk and knocked on the door. Harold watched as the door opened, and instead of handing over the package with the medicine, Harold watched Powell being invited into the house, where Powell would try to slaughter the Secretary of State and most of the people therein. Harold heard screaming and panicked and rode off, abandoning Powell while he was still in the house, and Powell seriously injured 5 people, leaving blood all over the house, and the Secretary of State survived the attack, due in large part to the considerable bandages and splints he had been wearing. Some versions said that Harold took Powell's horse with him when he rode off, abandoning Powell to whatever fate had befallen him, and other versions said that Harold tied Powell's horse to a tree before riding away, and it seemed that Harold hurried back to the Star Tavern to warn Booth that his friend Powell had just been murdered inside the Secretary of State's house. Harold was arriving at the stables behind the theater just as Booth was riding away up the alley, and when Harold caught up with him, Booth was shouting that Lincoln had been shot down dead, and because Harold didn't know that Booth was the one who had done it, they skedaddled away together. Harold assumed that the gunman at the theater had something to do with whoever had attacked Powell inside Seward's house, and that they were right in the middle of a last-ditch Confederate raid on the Capitol, and as they hurried away from Ford's Theater, Harold was shouting the news to Booth about his friend Powell having come to some harm yet unknown. When Booth had jumped down onto the stage after shooting Lincoln, he had landed badly and broken his tibia, but Booth had been so full of adrenaline and alcohol that he'd been able to reach the alley and gotten onto his horse being held by a little boy named Peanut of African descent. And when they pulled up to catch their breath, Booth told Harold that he'd fallen and hurt his leg trying to escape from the pandemonium. Soon enough, Harold and Booth reached the National Hotel, and Booth stayed outside in the back, sitting on his horse, waiting for George Atzerodt and Harold to help him into the room, and for them to come take care of the horses. But George was not answering the door when Harold continued to knock. As soon as they got inside the room, Booth knew they could take it easy for the rest of the night, awaiting the glory that would be theirs in the morning. But the desk clerk refused to open the door for Harold, who went back outside and told Booth to come talk to the desk clerk. By this time, the adrenaline and most of the alcohol had worn off, and Booth was in so much pain that he wanted Dr. Mudd to look at his injured leg, and Harold offered to take Booth to his own boss, who was a doctor, but Booth insisted on going to his friend Dr. Mudd across the river in Maryland, and Harold agreed to help him. Booth was wearing thigh-high leather boots, folded down into what was called a top boot, and Dr. Mudd would have to cut the boot along the front to remove it, slicing from the top of his foot all the way up his shin, so the tight boot could be removed. And Dr. Mudd would fashion a splint for the leg that had broken a few inches above the ankle, and he would supply Booth with a pair of crutches. Getting across the bridge out of Washington, D.C. had been a problem, because Maryland was under military occupation, and no civilians were allowed over any of the bridges after 9 p.m. And when Harold and Booth set out for Dr. Mudd's house, it was way past curfew. Harold put forth that getting across the bridge to Dr. Mudd's was no problem, because Harold's father worked at the Navy Yard, and they could take the Navy Yard bridge, and after Harold told the sentry to let Booth across, Harold would follow him after a few minutes. If Harold would have just gone home, everything would have been all right for him, but if Washington, D.C. were under attack, Harold thought it would be safer to shelter in the southern sympathizing state of Maryland, and he knew that his father would be proud of him for taking that precautionary move. It was 2 miles from the National Hotel to the Navy Yard Bridge, and after crossing, Harold and Booth would ride 9 miles to the Surratt compound, and they would arrive right around midnight. Harold's life would have been saved by just going home, but he was operating under the assumption that Booth had been the victim of a terrible catastrophe, and that they had both narrowly narrowly escaped the Confederate uprising of the night, some final attempt by the rebels to punish the North, and Harold was a good boy who just wanted to be helpful. After successfully crossing the bridge, they arrived at the Surratt compound, and instead of waiting there for someone to send for Dr. Mudd, they were warned that the police were arresting people because Lincoln had been shot, and Booth and Harold were told it would be better for them to ride on to Dr. Mudd's house themselves, rather than staying at the Surratt compound where the police were expected at any moment. Dr. Mudd had enrolled in the same Georgetown college where Harold had received his pharmacy license in 1860, and Dr. Mudd had enrolled in 1850 and gone on to study medicine in Baltimore, and Dr. Mudd had graduated in 1856. On the 23rd of December in 1864, Booth had gone out to look at some property that Dr. Mudd had for sale, and the doctor had introduced Booth to John Surratt, and Mudd and Booth came back that day to the National Hotel, and people had remembered seeing them together on that day because Booth had become quite famous and people were paying attention to whatever he did. That same day, on the 23rd of December, the day before Christmas Eve, Harold had been making a delivery out to Dr. Mudd's farm, and so he knew where it was, and even though he had just missed meeting John Wilkes Booth that day, Harold had gotten a positive impression from Dr. Mudd. Because he had been to the Mudd farm, Harold was willing to help Booth get there safely. And Dr. Mudd lived 11 miles to the south of the Surratts. And Harold had already known John Surratt because Harold had attended the Charlotte Military Academy High School, which was 20 miles south of the Surratt compound, and Harold had traveled through the Surratt crossroads several times on his way to visit his family in Washington, D.C. on weekends and holidays, and after that he may have seen John Surratt and his friends on the streetcars around town. George Atzerodt and John Surratt were smugglers, and the prime commodity to smuggle during the war between the states was morphine for wounded soldiers, especially those who were in danger of withdrawal. During the war, smugglers and blockade runners could be shot on the spot because there was little difference between a spy and a smuggler, and it's possible that Harold had been making money on the side under the color of humanitarianism, and Harold was only 2 years older than John Surratt. George Atzerodt had a rowboat at Port Tobacco, and it was possible that meeting Harold that afternoon at the Star Tavern on the 14th of April, before Booth took him down to the Kirkwood Hotel, had led George to believe that Booth and the nurse orderly Powell were just setting up a new morphine connection with Harold for the smuggling operation being run out of the Surratt compound, and if that's also what Powell had believed, George would have been happy to go along with the arrangement. At the tribunal, George would swear that he had heard about Booth's plan to assassinate Lincoln only 2 hours before the shooting, and it's also possible that he hadn't believed it because Booth was always talking that way, but this thing with Harold was just business. Booth and Harold had taken their horses across the river to the Surratt compound in Maryland and had gone from there to see Dr. Mudd, who lived in a house 20 miles southeast of Washington, D.C., just 10 miles north of where he had been born and raised on his father's tobacco plantation, where they had owned almost 100 slaves. The Surratt compound was 10 miles north of Mudd's tobacco farm, and Dr. Mudd had met John Wilkes Booth in December of 1864, when the well-paid actor had come out to inquire about the property Mudd was selling. And that same day, on the 23rd of December, when Dr. Mudd came into town and had drinks with Booth at the National Hotel, they were joined by Louis Weichman, Louis Weichman, who was renting a room from Mary Surratt. Dr. Mudd introduced John Wilkes Booth to John Surratt that day, on the 23rd of December at the National Hotel, and the National Hotel was 3 blocks west of the stables where Booth was supposed to return the horses on the 14th of April. And after Booth went to have Dr. Mudd set his broken leg, Booth and Harold had ended up 4 miles east of Port Tobacco, and they hid out in the swamp for a week, hoping George would show up, but George had been arrested and was locked in shackles aboard an ironclad along with Powell. Booth and Harold finally found someone else to take them in a small boat across the Potomac into Virginia, and they were surrounded by Union soldiers, and Harold surrendered, but Booth refused and paid the price. Harold may have been involved in some minor drug smuggling with John Surratt beforehand, but the tribunal demanded that the crime be a Confederate scheme rather than some young people behaving badly, which is what young people do. and Powell was about to turn 21 years old, and Harold was about to turn 23, and Robert Lincoln was just about to turn 22 and would continue to hate Americans of African descent to his dying day. John Surratt had turned 21 years old the day before the assassination, and if Dr. Mudd had been involved in morphine smuggling, he would have known both of the local young men involved in the business, George Atzerodt and John Surratt. The Surratt compound in Maryland was at a major crossroads, through which Dr. Mudd traveled on his way back and forth from Washington, D.C., and so would have George Atzerodt, and the Union Army had built Camp Stanton just a couple miles east of Dr. Mudd's parents' plantation. Camp Stanton was a training camp for Union soldiers of African descent that was established in August of 1863, and the 7th Regiment of United States Colored Troops, USCT, had been organized in Baltimore and trained at Camp Stanton, and they were joined by the 9th, 19th, and 30th Regiments, and they all participated in hard combat during the final campaigns of the war. John Wilkes Booth had been born and raised on a farm 10 miles northwest of Baltimore, and almost 9,000 soldiers of African descent had been trained at Camp Stanton in Maryland, and from his parents' winter residence in Baltimore, Booth would have ridden on the train with the USCT soldiers, and both Powell, Weichman, and John Surratt would have seen them on the train from Baltimore. Powell had deserted from the Confederate Army in January of 1865 and made his way to Baltimore to see the nurse who had helped him, and he arrived in Baltimore on the 14th of January and moved in with the nurse, and Booth and Powell had probably met sometime on that train. The next day that Powell arrived in Baltimore, the same day that Powell arrived in Baltimore on the 14th of January, John Surratt and Weichman had bought a boat at Port Tobacco, where George Atzerodt lived 20 miles south of the Surratt compound, and Louis Weichman and John Surratt had gone to Baltimore on the 21st of January, and to explain the boat at the military tribunal, Powell came up with the story about Booth wanting to kidnap Lincoln, which had seemed like more of a gentlemanly prank, since being a smuggler was the same as being a spy and could get them shot. And Powell's lawyer told him to just pretend he was crazy, so the story about wanting to kidnap Lincoln seemed to fit the bill. There had been hard shortages of morphine for the legions of wounded soldiers for some time, and Powell didn't think it was fair for the North to have so much more of the drug than the South, and the story about kidnapping Lincoln quickly evolved into their being able to ransom the president in exchange for some kind of prisoner swap, but more likely the demand from these young men was for morphine for the wounded Confederate soldiers, and that's why John Surratt had bought the boat with Booth's money on the 14th of January. Powell showed up at Mary Surratt's in early February asking for John Surratt, and Powell asked for a meal and a room, which she gave him when her son John got home and vouched for Powell, who went back to Baltimore and got arrested for beating up a slave girl at the nurse's mother's boarding house on the 12th of March, but was let out of jail 2 days later. Powell took the train back to the Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C., and he stayed for 3 days and left again, and it was more than likely that Powell had been on his way back to his girlfriend in Baltimore after the attack on Secretary Seward. He'd probably gone right back to Ford's Theater to report to Booth what he had done, and there had found out that Booth killed Lincoln, and then gone to the National Hotel, where George no longer was, and so Powell had gone to ground. Powell's rented horse was found later at Eastern Avenue and Bladensburg Road, abandoned 4 miles north of the Navy Yard Bridge, on the border with Maryland, less than a mile away from the bridge over the Anacostia River, so it seemed he was on his way to get to the railroad station outside the metropolitan area, where he could safely board the train to Baltimore, but had not been able to get across the bridge to the train station in Bladensburg because of the heightened military alert after the assassination. Instead of taking the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad to Baltimore, Powell had turned around and gone back to Mary Surratt's boarding house on foot, and the horse had been abandoned because the police would probably be looking for it, and stealing horses was a hanging offense. 3 days later, Powell arrived on foot at Mary Surratt's boarding house, 5 blocks away from Ford's Theater, and he was arrested right away. And in his pocket was the hotel address and room number of his Baltimore nurse girlfriend. The police had been at the boarding house within hours after the assassination, but had found nothing, and so they had watched and waited, and Powell showed up late on Monday night, and Mary Surratt claimed not to know him. The newspapers would say that it took 4 hours for the Metropolitan Police to show up at the boarding house because they needed to explain how John Surratt had time to escape their dragnet. And when Powell showed up after dark on Monday night, the police who were waiting in surveillance had people with them who had witnessed Powell's vicious attack on the Secretary of State, and so the police took the whole lot of them at the boarding house into custody. The authorities called it a Confederate conspiracy of spies, and Mary Surratt would hang alongside a nurse orderly, a pharmacy assistant, and a drug smuggler. And Dr. Mudd told the authorities that Booth had told him the broken leg was from his horse falling on him, not from leaping from the presidential box onto the stage after shooting Abraham Lincoln. The attack on the Secretary of State had been consistent with Powell's method of frightening the Yankees into agreeing that it was best not to have to face any further action from the Southern soldiers and their terrifying zeal, and Powell had hoped that the Confederate General George Johnston would be able to rally his 89,000 troops and force an armistice with the new President Johnson that would include more independence for a post-war South, but it was not to be. Powell knew that the North could not be beaten, and he also knew that they were as weary of the war as was the South, but what Powell didn't know was that Lincoln had already been negotiating a peace with General Joe Johnston, an arrangement that accommodated all the conciliatory points being asked by the South, including the reestablishment of state governments and civilian benefits and civil rights allowances that would bring about a compassionate and forgiving end to the war. The actions of Booth and Powell actually hurt the South, because with the death of Lincoln, General Grant assumed authority under martial law, and Grant's military-only concessions would prevail, rather than Lincoln's leniency.